Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, I wanted to go back in history. I want to talk about what ifs. And I think what ifs are important. If we could go back in time and we could see into history, would the same history repeat itself? And I want to go back to the late 1980s, the early 1990s, 1998, 1989, 1990, 1991. Some of you watching the channel may remember the fall of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where we saw the rise of the former Soviet client states such as Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, what have you. But if we were to go back to the very beginning of the 1990s, 1990, 1991, and we were to tell current Russian leadership, Soviet leadership, what have you, that in about 30 years, you would see a war, a devastating war, between Russia and Ukraine. Not only that, decades earlier, you would also see Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What would have happened? What would have NATO said? Would NATO acknowledge that eventually the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, would join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? I would have to say right now that NATO would utterly deny that prospect. But again, as the Soviet Union collapsed, I am certain that if the Soviet leadership, the Russian leadership, knew what was coming in terms of all these eastern states joining NATO, I'm not sure history would have repeated itself. I think things would look quite a bit different. I'm not sure that the Russians at the time, when many of these states became independent, would have allowed that if they could have seen into the future. And I got to tell you, if you were living in the late 80s, early 80s, during the Cold War period, where the Soviet Union fully existed, and I were to tell you that in the future that Russia and Ukraine would be in this catastrophic war, that would have almost seemed like an impossibility. Because again, Ukraine, being part of the Soviet Union, was just seen as the Soviet Union. The same with the Baltic states as well. It was just something that would have been very, very difficult to imagine, that this is what the future would look like. And again, going back in time, I'm not sure those Soviet leaders would have proceeded the way they did if they knew the final outcome. This is where we would be in the year 2023. Interesting. But we continue to watch the front lines in Ukraine. The noose continues to tighten around Bakhmut. I wanted to go back just a few days back, maybe till March, little March 10th, where you, the viewer, can kind of see what has happened as this vicious fighting continues. Right now, it's mainly street-to-street, house-to-house fighting that is occurring in Bakhmut. And then that's kind of where we were on March 10th. We'll fast forward things a bit. And you can see the noose continues to tighten. The gray areas where active fighting is taking place. So again, as I've talked about before, I'm not certain at this point that the Ukrainians can get out of Bakhmut. I have a feeling that an ultimatum was issued to Ukrainian forces to withdraw from Bakhmut. That did not occur, and now those Ukrainian forces are essentially trapped in Bakhmut. And if we look at the force composition of Russian forces, to the south it's kind of interesting. You have the 137th Guards Airborne Regiment from the 106th Guards Airborne Division. So again, these are all not Wagner forces fighting. If we go over the direction of attack, again, these are Russian VDV formations. Here, the 217th Airborne Regiment from the 98th Airborne Division. Again, so you have elements of two Russian airborne divisions operating in this southern sector of Bakhmut. If you go further to the east, along this area, yes, this is where we see the Wagner formations, and then being directly supported by, I would imagine, the artillery assets from the 57th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the Russian military. And again, it continues to tighten. At the same time, we are continuing to see Russian forces in this area push up towards what is eventually going to be Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in terms of where the fighting is going to present itself. We anticipate the Russians will continue to try and push towards Sloviansk, while at the same time, again, as we talked about that operation here to the east, north, and south of Seversk, we continue to see the massing of Russian forces in this area. And what's interesting, over the last 24 hours, we have heard Zelensky come out and say that he does not have, or the Ukrainian military does not have the capability to launch counter-offensive operations against Russian forces due to lack of supplies, lack of tanks, lack of equipment. So again, the likelihood that the Ukrainians are preparing for some sort of Russian operation is highly likely. And I suspect, again, that it's going to be in this area to the north of Seversk. Right now, the Russian forces are positioning themselves for a double enveloping maneuver around all these Ukrainian forces that are positioned near Seversk and east of Seversk along this defensive line here. And again, probably going to take place in summer, late summer at this point. Other news headlines. We're now hearing about the Kremlin discussing plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. And again, this is where we need to hit the pause button and we need to look at history. Back in the 80s, early 90s, 1970s, 1960s, there were not only tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, but there were also strategic nuclear weapons as well, based in Belarus. There were tactical nuclear weapons based in Poland. So again, this is not something that should surprise anyone. I mean, even during the Soviet times when, yes, there was a Cold War, but there was relative peace. Right now, you have a major conventional war taking place in Ukraine. And to think that the Russians are not going to position tactical nuclear weapons in what is rapidly becoming the new Russian client state, which is Belarus. It's going to happen. especially given the tensions right now between NATO and Russia. Again, here in the West, we watch the news, we listen to what's happening, we know there's a war in Ukraine, but we don't fully understand how dangerous this conflict is. I think the perception of danger is more prevalent in Russia, in these eastern states, than it is here in the United States. Again, this could turn foul very quickly. And what I mean by that is, again, the prospect of the Russians using tactical nuclear weapons, especially if the Crimea is threatened. I continue to watch some of these other content providers on YouTube. Some of these are pro-Ukrainian individuals that have since fled Ukraine. They are no longer in Ukraine, but they are still producing their content overseas for whatever reason. They maybe claim safety. Maybe they don't want to be drafted in the Ukrainian military. But they continue to talk about the prospect of a large-scale Ukrainian operation to take control of Crimea. If Ukraine wants to get nuked, then it may go after Crimea. The Russians, again, I've said this time and again, the Ukrainians are not getting the Crimea back. The only way that's going to happen, again, is if the Ukrainian military, supported by Western nation states, are able to militarily defeat these Russian forces in this land corridor near Zaporizhia, Kherson, and other areas. And again, the Russians are not going to allow that. It's just not going to happen. And we're in a scenario now where if, for some reason, that the Ukrainians are able to threaten Crimea conventionally, meaning they have successfully crossed the Dnieper River, they have conducted an operation where they have trapped Russian forces, maybe between Melitopol and the Dnieper River, I can almost guarantee you with certainty the Russians will resort either to chemical weapons or the direct deployment of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian forces. Now, we're not there yet. That hasn't happened. In the likelihood, given the rhetoric that's now coming out of Kiev, talking about they just don't have the capability to launch an offensive right now. Now, that could be some sort of deception operation, and maybe they are getting ready for an offensive operation. We just don't know at this point. I doubt it. I don't think so. But, again, hypothetically, if they do, and they are able to make inroads towards Melitopol and threaten Crimea, then yeah, the Russians are going to use tactical nuclear weapons. They are not going to give back Crimea. The Russians see Crimea as part of Russia. Just not going to happen. And again, if it does, if we do see ourselves where the Ukrainians are successful conventionally and are pushing the Russians back to threaten Crimea, it's not going to be pretty. But I don't think we're at that point yet. In fact, again, I think we're going to see a Russian operation, again, probably near Seversk. Again, it looks like that the Russians are preparing for this very large maneuver operation north of Seversk. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. Difficult to say at this point. It could be some sort of, again, deception operation by the Russians, and the Russians are intending a operation elsewhere. But we just don't know at this point. So that's kind of where we are at today. We will continue to monitor. We will continue to report. Again, we're watching Bakhmut very closely. We continue to watch the developing pocket in Seversk, and then obviously the fighting is taking place down here towards Avdiivka as well. And that about covers it for today. Thank you for joining us. We'll have more very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.